Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So, I think that we've had a bunch of different opinions on my show in regards to the lockdowns in Ontario, both pro and con. We had two people on 2 weeks ago. One, Roman Baber, who is the MPP that got kicked out of the Conservative caucus because he opposed the lockdowns, and Alex Vesna, CEO of an emergency preparedness company, who thought we should have been more severe in the lockdowns. And so I think it's kind of interesting. And back before Christmas, we had a whole week where we focused on local restaurants and retail stores and how devastating the lockdown has been on small businesses in all of Ontario, but particularly in Mississauga and areas. And so I thought I'd bring on Jane Harvey. Jane Harvey is a lawyer. She's been practicing law for 45 years, the last 40 as a consumer lawyer. She's got retail locations in the GTA, including 2 in Peel, one at the Dixie Mall and one in Brampton Shoppers World. Her specialties are business law, real estate, and matrimonial litigation. She's a former bencher of the Law Society. She's also an entrepreneur and a business person. She's got a great B&B downtown near Yorkville, I'm told. Got to check it out at some point in time. Jane is very opposed to the second government lockdown in Ontario that started in November of 2020. She thinks it's unnecessary, excessive, and devastating to the economy. And even worse, she says, we don't know if it's actually going to end March 8th after endless nonsensical extensions. Jane, welcome to our show. Those are pretty strong thoughts.
Well, thanks, Brian. Unfortunately, it's true. I appreciate in the beginning when the pandemic first hit in March and they shut down March 18th, I could certainly understand the first lockdown. Governments didn't know how to deal with it. And they imposed emergency powers. But since then, they've grown addicted to emergency powers and they're misusing them.
They've just grown addicted to emergency powers. Addicted.
That's right.
That's a strong word.
And it's something to be used with restraint, and it's not being used with restraint in Ontario.
Why do you say that?
A couple of reasons. Basically, from November, when the government came back with lockdown on retail, basically shut down non-essential retail just 6 weeks prior to Christmas, I started to try to organize small business to oppose it. The only effective group really trying to oppose it was the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. And of course, 2 MPPs, Randy Hillier and Roman Baber, as you mentioned, have been trying as well. But look what happened to them. Randy Hillier was charged after organizing a protest in November. It was a peaceful protest, absolutely no reason to shut it down or to charge people. I mean, that's not acceptable. We're allowed to assemble in this country. And basically, whenever a retailer has tried to open, perhaps, the classic case is the barbecue case in Toronto. But many retailers have tried to go with the rules, but still be open. So, for example, by selling food, because food was an essential service. I personally saw the Toronto enforcement officers shut down the florist shops on Avenue Road and fine those guys. And we're not talking small fines, we're talking $10,000, $15,000. And the individual BIAs and the large citywide BIA in Toronto have been too scared to take any action. And also, they're funded by the city of Toronto. Right. So there's a conflict there. So basically, there's been no one in a position to effectively defend the private sector in Ontario. And I find that pretty scary.
No one to defend the private sector.
That's right. You know, it's interesting. In preparation for our get-together, I actually took a look at a few sources. I took a look at the CDC. I took a look at the WHO. I took a look at what the federal government said to the provinces. And basically those 3 rather impressive bodies didn't suggest that the provinces go into lockdown. They did suggest health measures. They suggested masks. They suggest distancing, but they at no time suggested lockdown of business. So this is something the provinces, and to be fair to the provinces, other countries have done the same thing. States in the US have done it, New York, California. Fortunately, Florida has not done so. But basically sorry.
How's it worked out for Florida relative to California and New York?
Well, Florida has also experienced a downturn because obviously the tourism trade is not as healthy as it used to be. So there are empty storefronts. I am in Florida now, in Miami, and I can tell you that in the same way that Toronto has stores with many streets with many empty stores, the same is true here. But at least here they have a chance to survive. So even if they're doing business that's not as strong as it was last year, virtually every type of business is open here. I went to the gym today, and basically everything is operating the way it operated in Ontario in the summer. Right. And we all saw that model, and it worked in Ontario.
So
and it's working down here, and there was no reason to shut that model down in November.
I interviewed the CEO of a big fitness chain, and he had said that they had something like 103,000 people had come through the fitness chain during the summer months when he was open. And he said they did very intensive contact tracing of them, and they didn't have one infection that they found that had come from the gym, not one. With 103.
Well, that's right. I went to Good Life all summer in Toronto. They were exceptionally careful. They didn't allow the same number of people into the classes, but they cleaned the equipment. And my understanding, and yours as well, I'm sure, is that there's been a very low incidence of COVID in retail and in gyms and in restaurants. Now, bars may be a different story. If people aren't keeping their masks on because they're drinking and they're not distancing. But by far and large, the wide retail community should have been open all this time. Now, the problem is we're getting to the 1-year mark. So we were shut down in March, and now it's March again. And most businesses can put up with shutdown for maybe 6 weeks, but this is too long. And if we don't open March 8th, as we're supposed to do, it'll be serious. Just to use my own firm as an example, we're an essential service. We were able to stay open. So I had 7 locations at the beginning of COVID. Now I have 6 locations. I had to close one. Our sales are down a good 20 to 30%, which basically takes out the profit element from the firm. And basically we're operating very close to break even. And some months we're below break even. I think a misconception when people think of businesses, they think that, businesses have savings, they have resources. But just to give you a real life example, my business had $100,000 in the bank March 18th. Now that may seem like a lot of money, but my overhead per month is just rent and salaries and nothing else. Like no Business Depot, no hydro, nothing. It's 80 grand a month. So really the 100,000 I had at the beginning was a float to cover client disbursements, things running through the bank account. But basically the average person in my position would be closed now. I mean, I've stayed open to keep my 12 full-time employees in work, and also to continue to provide consumer legal services to Ontario.
But I think what you're suggesting that this is a problem that a lot of businesses are going to have, the ones that haven't gone bankrupt. They're going to be saddled with a huge amount of debt that they didn't have before. I've spoken to, yoga studio owners that have got like $100,000, $150,000 in debt that they'll never be able to make enough money to pay back.
Well, many of my clients are just straight out of business. To give you an example, one guy bought a restaurant just before COVID, paid $250,000. Then when the restrictions came in and he could only do outdoor dining, he put another 50 in for the patio. Then he shut down. So he's out of business, $300,000. He financed that mortgage on his house. He's got to pay that back, but is he going to open another restaurant? Is he going to invest in Ontario? And really, the sad part is this wasn't necessary. Like, you know, you keep things open. The restaurants were open 25%. I mean, it wasn't great, but it was at least enough to continue on in business.
And I think what happened is because the restaurants weren't open, people were entertaining people in their homes, and the safety measures in people's homes were far poorer than the restaurants. Anyway, we're going to take a break. We're going to come back in just a minute with Jane Harvey and talk more about what happened and why, and what could have been done better. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting with Jane Harvey, who is a lawyer in Toronto. She's got, did you say 6 retail locations across the GTA?
That's right.
And you're of the belief that Ontario has made a big mistake in closing down retail. Particularly, you were saying maybe not the first close down, the first lockdown, but the second lockdown you think has been a big mistake. And you're comparing it to Florida, and actually, I think you went out and compared it with some other countries and practice as well. Let me ask you a question. If government took away my business to build a road or something, they would expropriate it, and they'd have to pay me, the value of my business if they forced me out of business. Haven't they sort of expropriated my business because of a public health measure? Don't they?
Totally agree. However, the chances of recovering are probably limited. Now, someone could bring a class action because it's pretty easy to quantify the damages. But the problem with emergency measures, as you know, Hudson's Bay Company brought an action to stay open, and they lost because the judge found that emergency measures superseded their economic interests. So this is one of the very serious problems with emergency measures. I mean, let's face it, in Canada, the last time I can think emergency measures were used was during the FLQ crisis. Wow. I mean, there may have been others, but this gives you an idea of how serious the emergency measures.
This is their mistake because they didn't have the right public health measures put in place. And you know, the examples, and I've interviewed lots of people of this, are frankly shocking. Where after SARS, we had a judicial commission that recommended having a whole bunch of PPE and a whole bunch of ventilators, respirators available. And what happened is we started it, we didn't complete it, and we didn't maintain them, and so they were no good. So even the things that we recommended that we do in the province of Ontario to get ready for a coming pandemic, we didn't do. And you know, they kept on saying the reason why we need to do this is we don't have the hospital capacity. Well, is that our fault that the province hasn't planned for the appropriate hospital capacity? So they've expropriated our business. They've forced businesses to shut down. Why can't we get compensation?
Well, because the judges will read the emergency powers legislation to supersede the economic power. I mean, really, I hate to say it, economic rights are not well defended in this country. So I would think the chances of any private sector getting compensation is very low, which is all the more reason why government has to be more sensitive to creating this immense harm. I mean, I think what happened, this is just conjecture, with the current Ontario Gov, is that they signed on to the rather limited color-coded system of deciding when to stay open and when to close. And frankly, I went looking for the basis on which they made this color-coded concept. And I didn't see anything in the CDC. I didn't see anything in the WHO. So it's something they've created themselves, I believe. Not, you know, I stand to be corrected. But I think they made it too limited, too narrow. And also, they frankly did not obtain input from the private sector. And frankly, they didn't obtain input from teachers or public servants either. Now, I appreciate it's difficult in an emergency situation to get input from all sectors. But I think you have to get input from your economic sector, because worst case scenario, you don't have a private sector. Who's paying the taxes for the public sector and for the gov? You know, it's interesting. I've spoken to a lot of people during lockdown to see what their views are on lockdown. And I've really been shocked by the number of, in fact, I spoke to a former premier of the province, whose name shall not be mentioned. And I said, I gave him the story I gave you about the cafe owner of the $250,000 investment plus 50 plus gone. And he said, oh, you know, really, I haven't minded COVID. I've been up north. I come into town 3 days a week. I'm sitting on boards. Well, yeah, he's not affected economically or socially or anything else. But the average, and people, you know, civil servants, frankly, haven't been affected.
For some of them, they're better off. They're working from home.
That's right. And I don't mean to be unsympathetic to those sectors, but, you know, they've shown total disregard for the private sector. And just to give you a little detail on Ontario, I don't know if you caught the CFIB letter to the members of Provincial Parliament, Queen's Park, dated February 3rd, 2021. He talks about, the president talks about how many businesses in Ontario, small firms, are fully open. It's the lowest in the country, of course, at 37%. BC's at 64%, Alberta 60%, Saskatchewan 76%, Manitoba, which of course had draconian lockdowns, of course, is even better than us at 45%. PEI, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, I mean, they're all above us. I mean, we're supposed to be the driver for Canada.
So why do you think the lockdown has been more severe here and longer?
It's almost like someone is sabotaging the Ontario economy and, as a result, the Canadian economy. I mean, let's look at all the big box stores. They're doing well. They're all
doing that.
Sorry?
Why would Doug Ford be doing that?
I honestly don't know. I thought he was a business guy, but I don't think so anymore. Now, maybe he's trapped by this framework he's set up with the various color codes, but man, it's time to break out of it. You know, I read the New York Post every day, and the articles I've seen in the New York Post this last week, I mean, even Governor Cuomo and de Blasio, the mayor of New York, and they've been very repressive. They realize New York is dying. I have an article here. 47% of businesses in New York are closed. They've now hired a full-time person to try to revive the New York economy. I mean, what are we waiting for? It's very easy for us to go back no later than March 8th to the system we had all summer, and then upgrade it pretty quickly. We may be living with COVID for years. But well, the economy can't take any more of this treatment.
I think most people believe we are going to be living with COVID for years, and now we may be.
Well, I think we should operate under that assumption. And if we're wrong, we're wrong. But we have to assume that we have to keep our businesses going.
So, I've interviewed a couple of different people. Diane Francis, for an example, one, Alex Vesna, who's CEO of an emergency preparedness company. And both of them said lockdowns were critically important, but they should have been quicker, more severe, and shorter. And
how could they have been more severe?
We locked down everyone effectively for 2-3 weeks back last March. And tried to completely eradicate the virus from spreading. But
it's easy to say that in hindsight, and we didn't do that.
Right.
And also, I have some stuff here from Wikipedia, various studies that have been done. Let me just read you a little bit.
Various studies of different lockdowns?
The success of lockdowns, economic and otherwise.
And what does it say?
Well, it talks about the various studies. So anybody can just Google Wikipedia COVID-19 lockdowns. Efficacy, On January 5th, 2021, the European Journal of Clinical Investigation publishes a study calling into question the effectiveness of the so-called restrictive and more restrictive lockdowns. The conclusions of the study, while some small benefits of severe lockdowns can't be excluded, they are not significant. And it's true, if you look at lockdowns in the various jurisdictions with the serious lockdowns, the COVID cases have continued in the same way. They all went up over Christmas as people got together in their homes.
Yeah.
Um,
But Singapore,
basically-
Japan, Hong Kong, South Korea, etc., Australia, New
had
Zealand,
nothing.
more
Yeah,
severe
that's right.
lockdowns.
Japan and South Korea had nothing. And then it says Google has consistently collected data on movements showing rapid declines in public activity long before legal restrictions were imposed. So here's another point. One thing I find highly insulting is the fact that the government of Ontario is assuming that we're not reasonable citizens. Now, I don't know about you, but most of my friends and acquaintances are wearing masks. They're distancing. They're behaving rationally. And yet the government has put these really unnecessary restrictions on people's behavior. And they've even called upon, I mean, I was shocked when Eileen de Villa, the medical officer for Toronto, called upon people to rat on each other if people went over to other people's houses. I mean, this is Ontario, this is Canada. I am sorry. That is not reasonable behavior by a government official.
What else do you think they've done that's unreasonable and not trusting of people?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I've started to go through the incidents of our lockdown and the restrictions in terms of number of people, and they're just so minutia. And you compare them with restrictions, and if you go into the WHO, you can see the restrictions that all the other countries of the world have put on people. And you'll find that while Ontario may not be the worst, as for example, Quebec and the curfew, at least we didn't go curfew, or in France where you weren't allowed to go more than 1 kilometer from your home. I mean, we're right up there. And it's just interesting. It's just a matter of common sense. And I haven't seen much common sense in Ontario.
Well, I was really surprised back in the spring when they closed the parking lots for parks. And the reason why, the justification for it was that they didn't think that people could socially distance, physically distance in a park. And you know, and they didn't actually close the parks, which was strange. Thankfully, they didn't close the parks, which meant really that all they did is limited the number of people that could go to the parks, and the people that were close to the parks were the ones that could make use of it, rather than the people that were farther away. And so they took away the opportunity for people that were living farther away from parks to get fresh air and exercise. And you know, I went to a bunch of parks, and people were, you know, on numerous occasions, I was walking down a path, and people would divert and walk 6 feet away on the other side of the path. And you had this one instance in Trinity Bellwoods Park where lots of people were out. But I think that was one of these things where people, once, you know, they felt insulted by the prior rules, and once it opened up, they just went crazy. But I think that was a big mistake, and government showed.
Well, and that was an exception too. I mean, generally speaking, I mean, yes, there's been the odd party here and there, but really there's been very little in Ontario. And by the way, even in Florida here, there is a curfew. It's 12 midnight. So everything shuts down at 12 midnight, bars, restaurants, etc. And there are parties here. And if you have a party, I think it's over 30 people, then you'll get a ticket. But, you know, when you turn, I hate to also blame the media here, but I am going to blame the media. I think the media have blown this whole COVID thing way beyond perspective. And they've just parroted everything the medical officers of health have said. And they've created an atmosphere of panic among Ontarians. Like if you watch TV down here, No one is scaring you to death. They do give you the stats. Of course, down here, as you know, in the US, 50% of all adults over 65 are vaccinated. And I've been vaccinated. I've had 2 vaccines here because I'm a property owner down here. But the whole idea here is like, you know, we're in a difficult situation. Let's work through this together. Let's support each other. And I would suggest that when we finally do get vaccines in Ontario, that we follow the Florida example, which started off initially just in hospitals. The problem with that was that the hospitals are usually in the richer parts of town. And so now they've expanded it to grocery stores, drugstores, all over town. They also go to people's houses. Really, Governor DeSantis has done a fantastic job here.
Really, this is interesting.
Yes.
So that the sense you get from more left of center media, CNN, CNBC, is that he's done a disaster, and Fox would suggest that he's done an okay job. Is the problem the media?
I haven't heard a single Floridian complain about him.
Really?
Even friends of mine who are over 65 and who really did not come out of their houses, because the COVID rate in Florida is very high. But, you know, I think if you wear a mask and you follow the distancing and the cleaning and you wash your hands frequently, you know, I don't think you're at risk. But even my friends who really, really were super paranoid and did not come out until they've now had their 2 vaccines kind of thing, they're not complaining about DeSantis either. I think they appreciate that he's been very supportive throughout. And instead of
what he said is he was cognizant
instead of talking down to people and saying, "Oh, rat on your neighbor," you know, like this is Toronto we're talking about. This is Mississauga. I mean, we're the heartbeat of Canada, and we're behaving like this. I mean, it's embarrassing.
We're chatting today with Jane Harvey, a lawyer who disagrees dramatically with the lockdown in Ontario. We're going to take a break and come back more with Jane in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're having an interesting chat with Jane Harvey. She's a lawyer here in the GTA. She's got 6 different retail locations of law offices around the GTA, 2 in Peel. And she disagrees dramatically with the second lockdown, thinks that it was uncalled for and has destroyed economies. And she also cites that, or the economics for businesses. And she also cites a couple different businesses that are, if not bankrupt, ladled with debt that is going to make them unsustainable probably and create financial pressures. You know, one of the interesting things, Jane, is that you haven't, and I think you mentioned this, you haven't heard a lot of voices from people that disagree and challenge. And it's been kind of interesting that you haven't. And you mentioned Hillier, who got charged, and Babber, who got kicked out of caucus. It's almost like it's politically incorrect to challenge the status quo in regards to the provincial beliefs and the beneficial effects of lockdowns.
Well, I think it's worse than that.
It's worse than that.
Yes, I don't think it's a sign of a healthy society when, and certainly not a healthy political party, when they refuse to listen to other points of view from inside the party and from the community. I mean, I really have never experienced the environment of Ontario in the past year in Canada before. And, you know, as a practicing lawyer, I am interested in situations where civil rights are challenged, when I see intolerant behavior, particularly on the part of government. And I should also say that I'm not opposed to government. I used to work for the Attorney General of the province. So I'm not a a rabid libertarian, but I am concerned that this COVID issue has not been handled well. I certainly appreciate in the beginning, no one knew what was going on. We weren't prepared, but no one else was either. So I'm not faulting any government for not being ready at the beginning. However, I think really, and particularly after the summer, we had a very successful distancing masks program going. To abruptly end that and go back into lockdown, and then literally to stay in lockdown, like in business. I mean, imagine being in business and not knowing how long you're locked down for. Like when the lockdown happened in November, it was supposed to come off like the day before Christmas or something, like, you know, totally screwing any sort of retail Christmas.
Yeah.
But it was supposed to come off then. And then it was kept on, and then kept on and kept on and kept on. I mean, that's sort of uncertainty for business.
Well, and you know, people
when it's really not necessary.
Blue Mountain just this past week told with 24 hours or whatever it is notice that they got to close the restaurants down. They would have had, you know, full inventories of food that are going to go to waste.
So the resort is open, but the restaurants are closed?
They've closed everything now.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So it had reopened, but now it's closed again with, you know, hardly any notice.
And on what basis? The variants, the new variants, is that the argument?
And infection rates up.
Well, listen, in Florida, the new variants are very much here in Florida. They're in New York. They're all over the US. New York is open now. California is open now. Florida never, you know, they were closed down for 3-4 months at the beginning, but they've been open ever since. They're not closing down because of the variants. Basically, I think a jurisdiction can't just be the government. It can't just be the health bureaucracy. And I want to point out a couple of things. CDC, WHO have not called for these lockdowns. The Ontario Medical Association, I went to their website today. While they make different recommendations from time to time, they haven't come down saying lockdown. So basically what we're looking at is political decisions, which in the case of Ontario have been delegated down to the chief medical officers. And you'll recall that early on in the pandemic in Ontario, the previous chief medical officer of health had the temerity to say, oh, this COVID, it's not as serious as they're saying. It is a very serious type of flu, but the measures being taken are not commensurate with the level of risk. He was on, I saw him in one media outlet, so I immediately put that on my Instagram, no lockdown GTA. I haven't seen him since. So here's the participation of the media in this. And I particularly want to call out CP24. I want to call out CBC, but really in terms of local Toronto, CP24. There hasn't been balanced reporting. It's all health. It's Dr. Bogosh morning, noon, and night pronouncing on things. And I'm sure he's not really wanting to be the health spokesman for Ontario, but effectively that's what he's become. It's just not realistic. In terms of the print media, the Star had been very pro-lockdown, even the National Post, although the Post has had some articles saying no lockdown, and the Sun has really been the only newspaper that said anything contrary to the lockdown. And I find that a little worrying. I mean, it's, as you say, it's political correctness, but it's political correctness contrary to the interests of our society.
So let's be clear. You do believe that COVID-19 is a real virus?
Oh, absolutely. People have died. I know people who have died.
And you aren't an anti-masker. You don't believe,
No.
like you're not one of these people that is no masks, hugs not, no masks.
Not at all.
And you do
And I've been
practice,
vaccinated.
and you practice physical distancing, and so you believe in 6 feet separation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we'll probably have to do it maybe for a couple of years. So what I think we have to do is get used. We have to coexist with the disease.
So you're not questioning the disease nor the public health measures taken to combat the disease. What you're questioning is the economic impact and the lockdown, and that we haven't, I guess, balanced the economic health with the public health issues.
That's right.
And I got to tell you that I just interviewed a psychotherapist who was adamant that the mental health issues are extreme, and we haven't even taken that into effect at all. That addiction issues are up dramatically. Violence against women is up dramatically. The
I've
role
heard about a lot of
women.
suicides.
So it's as if we've had a public health, a economic health, and a medical health issue, and we've only really paid attention to one, which is the
But
public.
here's the problem right now, Brian. If we don't get out of lockdown in Toronto and Peel like March 8th, there's going to be, you know how businesses sort of keep going. A lot of retail businesses kept going to the end of January. So when I was speaking with businesses in December, they said, well, we're going to continue through to the end of January. I guess they were hoping that they'd be open then and they could at least sell their inventory at 50% off. But that didn't happen. So really, it may already be too late. But if we don't open up now, it's been a year, and businesses that have barely managed to survive are now going to call it quits. I mean, why try anymore? It's got to that point.
No, I think the economic impacts, particularly on small and medium-sized businesses, particularly on retail businesses that are dependent on foot traffic, whether it be on main streets or in malls or whatnot, are devastated. I think restaurants, bars, live entertainment, live entertainers, artists, art galleries. Yeah.
Well, there's sort of a myth too there's sort of a myth that online has made up for in-store sales. Not true. I mean, I can give you the example of a really wonderful store on Yonge Street that sells a lot of Christmas decorations. And she had, I think, $100,000 or $150,000 of inventory. And of course, she was only allowed to do curbside, and then that shut down. So she said she'd tough it through to the end of January and then make a decision. And this is someone with a personal health issue who shouldn't really be working at all. So that's another example of these small retailers who, and you may say, what does a small retailer matter? They'll be replaced by other people. But the problem is a lot of people run little retail outlets and they don't really make much money for themselves, but they do hire people and they do rent space. And let's not forget that OMERS, which is one of our biggest pension funds, lives off the revenue from the big malls in Canada. So no retail, no mall revenue, no pensions for civil servants either. So it affects everyone.
2/3 to 75% of employment is small and medium-sized businesses. Now, it's not all retail, but it's small and medium-sized businesses. And so therefore, and I think that a lot of sales have been replaced online, but by the big American.
Well, what I was going to say is that
companies.
She found that online did not replace her business and it was more expensive to fulfill the orders.
Yeah, no, my argument is that it's Amazon and Best Buy.
Benefiting.
Best Buy's got record profits, but they're laying people off because their online's doing so well, and the retail stores, and that's not going to benefit Canadian employees or your point, Canadian landlords. So Jane, clearly your number one point is we got to open up.
Yes.
What else? Is there anything else that a small business person can do? They can't sue the government, you're saying. You can't join a class.
Well, I'm not discouraging them from doing so, but I wouldn't be optimistic about their chances of success. And, I am interested in doing some kind of an organization to try to get some compensation for retailers. But I fear, and the sad part, is that it's not really necessary if these businesses can continue on in business. But if you're out of business and you're out a huge investment, not only are you out that money, you're not going to try it again, probably. But if I could leave one final message, I mean, really, it's that the WHO study and the Wikipedia study, they all say the poor are getting poorer. Sure, you're getting your CSRS or CCRA, but ultimately those payments will end and you won't have a job. And that's not a good thing for anybody.
Well, there's no question that the rich and the people that have had the online businesses and the big American corporations have succeeded extremely well during the last 9 months. And local businesses have suffered dramatically. And so we got to make a change. And so I think one of the things is we at least need to question it. And so I agree with you that it's too bad that that people haven't been able to at least voice their concerns. You know, they don't have to have been accepted, but they should be listened to. And I had Roman Baber on my show. I didn't agree with everything he said, but he was articulate. He knew his stuff, and he made good arguments. And so he should have been listened to. And he shouldn't have been thrown on a caucus. Well, Jane, thank you so much for joining us. If people want to access your legal services, is there a website or do they have to come to your retail store?
No, we're available online. It's janeharveylawyers.com.
Jane Harvey, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian.
We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us.